There's an old interview with the drag queen Bianca Del Rio that I absolutely adore, where the interviewer asks her, "Do you think you can get away with so much because of all of this?" while indicating towards her look of the day, to which she responds, "Well, obviously this is the packaging to get away with murder, because if I don't wear this, then I just say, oh, what a nasty gay person. And then you put this on and they say, it's hysterical. And it stuck with me for a long time because it feels like it really sums up part of the appeal of drag." She goes on to explain that she's the same person in and out of drag, but when she's wearing all that makeup and one of a million cowl neck gowns in different fabrics, it suddenly changes how people perceive her. There's also this old video essay about cats from Lindsay Ellis that I've referenced a few times when explaining one of the reasons why I decided to become a VTuber. In describing why movie musicals tend to work better as animated films than live action, Ellis says, "An animated movie requires more suspension of disbelief because this isn't real, it's a drawing, and therefore it fits more easily with the requirements of believing that these characters might suddenly burst into song." She's not talking about live 2D in that video, but as a VTuber, this message really resonated with me. There's a lot that I can get away with in terms of everything from the content I produce, to how I produce it, to how I brand myself that I just could have never gotten away with back when I was live streaming with my real face and not under the VTuber umbrella because of this exact reason. Both of these things, I would argue, connect to a concept you might have heard about before: Jester's privilege. The Jester is privileged not in spite of being a clown, but because he's a clown. He's meant to be a silly little guy telling his silly little jokes, and for a variety of reasons, you can get away with a shocking amount of stuff if you're just a silly little guy. Or, in the words of Bob the drag queen, a suspiciously large woman. Jesters in courts throughout history have been able to get away with anything from mocking Henry VIII's inability to sire a son to slapping the Chinese Emperor Zongzong across the face if they could make a good joke out of it. But the concept of Jester's privilege goes beyond just getting to tell an edgy joke. It's the idea that the Jester could speak truth to power in a way that nobody else could. There's kind of a lot of pop culture historical revisionism around the concept because people like to take the idea and run with it, and obviously it's hard to verify how much what the Jesters or fools said actually affected the powerful, given that they weren't exactly going to be receiving a lot of credit for it. But what we're focused on here specifically is the way that drag and VTubing both serve as modern manifestations of the Jester, how the willingness to be camp, cringe, and over the top can enable you to get away with content, commentary, and critique that would otherwise be a tougher pill to swallow. Before we start, I want to say a quick thank you to my friend Puppo Losfeld for selecting this topic as his Donathon reward from last year, and I want to thank the channel members for picking it. This is the second Donathon reward topic that the members have picked in a row, with the resource extraction one from the beginning of the month also being a Donathon reward. Also, the footage in the background is going to be of Marvel Rivals for this one. It's apparently less bad for motion sickness, so I thought I'd test it out here, and also because I had a ton of fun with the closed alpha test, so I played a ton of it before it ended. If you'd like to see more of me playing the closed alpha test, there's some VODs over on the VODs channel, and I'm considering making a video about it in the future, but I don't want you to think this is a pivot away from Overwatch content in general or anything if that's what you enjoy. I just sometimes struggle with how to present this stuff, and I'm working on finding better ways to do it for video essays that aren't really about games. I also want to acknowledge that while the title of this video specifically references drag queens, this video will be about drag as a whole, and we'll get more into that later. Anyways, on to the video, starting with Part 1. Defining the terms. So, first things first, it's probably useful to explain what VTubing and drag are to the uninitiated. This video isn't going to require you to be intimately familiar with Paris's Burning or Kizuna AI or anything to understand what's going on, but given that I know a decent amount of my audience has no understanding of drag aside from a vague awareness of RuPaul's Drag Race as a concept, and don't follow any VTubers except yours truly, it'd be good to get everyone up to speed. Let's start with VTubing since that's the easier one to explain. For the unaware, I am a VTuber, which means that I use this little avatar in the bottom right as a bit of a puppet instead of using my own face or going fully faceless. Specifically, I'm a live 2D VTuber, which means that my model is a 2D model made up of hundreds of layers in a Photoshop file that were stitched together by a rigger in a program called Live 2D. Think of it like that scene from Infinity War where Thanos is torturing Nebula and separating her into a bunch of little pieces. It's like that, but anime. Since I'm a broke boy, I rigged my own model, which is why he's a little bit janky, but I'm pretty happy with him personally. Anyways, from there, you load up the model into a piece of software that can allow you to take control of him. I use VTube Studio, which allows me to use my iPhone's Face ID software to do face tracking. And then you're doing VTubing. Now, this is not the only kind of VTubing. There's also 3D VTubers, which is the same core concept with a 3D model instead of a 2D one and different tracking software, as well as PNG tubers, which are people who use a series of PNGs in a piece of reactive software to simulate speaking. I don't really have a 3D model to show you, but I do have a little Fugi reactive I can show you. He's just a wiggly little yapper, and I love him with my whole heart. Fugi is connected to Discord and senses when I'm speaking in a VC there. His mouth moves when mine does, and if I'm silent, his mouth stays closed. However, trying to define VTubing as one specific thing is like trying to define a chair. You can list criteria to be met, but ultimately you've just got to make a judgment call. Most people using a 2D or 3D animated model would call themselves a VTuber, but the PNG tubers are where it can get a bit complicated because there are a lot of content creators who use a reactive PNG to indicate when they're talking, but would never call themselves a VTuber. Somebody like The Right Opinion or even Illuminati would likely meet whatever criteria you set for a PNG tuber that would include people like Toledo, but they're just not VTubers. Hell, I was technically a PNG tuber for the 7 months before I became a live 2D VTuber by just about any criteria you could set, but nobody, including myself, called me one before I made the change. In that sense, it comes down to self-identification with the broader VTubing community. VTubing is itself not a particularly exclusive medium. You can be a VTuber musician, you can be a VTuber voice actor, you can be a VTuber video essayist, you can be whatever. VTubing is a medium, but it's a medium defined by how you present whatever you're doing rather than specifically what you're presenting. The history of VTubing is relatively short, but it is still relevant here. Kizuna AI, the broadly recognized first VTuber, only debuted in 2016. The scene initially spawned in Japan, but English language VTubing has quickly broken into the mainstream, with creators like Iron Mouse rapidly climbing up the leaderboards in terms of viewership on Twitch and winning some mainstream awards. VTubers tend to come in one of two flavors, indie or corporate. Indie VTubers, like yours truly, are VTubers without an agency. We're responsible for our own models, branding, licensing, and get to take home all of our own revenue, whatever of that exists. Corporate VTubers, or agency VTubers, are VTubers who are employed by an agency that'll handle some of that stuff in return for a cut of the profits. As well, being part of an agency typically means that you can start out with a bigger kick. There's sort of an initial growth that comes with being an agency VTuber that you just don't get as an indie. The big agencies right now are Nijisanji, Hololive, and VShojo, with the first two being more traditional agencies. They'll open auditions, people will apply, they'll pick talents to join their team, and then debut them as a group with models and rigging paid for and developed by the agencies, typically to fit a specific concept for the wave. VShojo is a bit different, in the sense that they tend to poach individual creators and allow them to run more independently while still being tied to the agency. The agencies are controversial, to say the least. This is particularly true of Nijisanji right now for reasons we do not have the time to get into, but in general, that's a rundown of VTubers. People who are using avatars that are either animated 3D models, animated 2D models, or reactive PNGs to create content either independently or through an agency. Drag, by contrast, is a bit more complicated. There is a bigger historical context to drag that reflects complex social, political, and cultural understandings of gender throughout time, both in society and in performance. For example, women weren't allowed to actually perform on stage in Shakespeare's day, so female roles in his plays were usually played by men or boys in drag. In cultures across the world throughout the eras, men in makeup, even big, dramatic, exaggerated makeup with elaborate outfits, were often, but not exclusively, just men in makeup without any connotation of gender bending. This is part of why gender is described as a social construct. The things that display gender and indicate gender are generally socially constructed, such as high heels, makeup, wigs, or certain types of clothing being indicators of femininity. They're not natural laws, they're what we assign meaning to. Our modern understanding of drag in the English-speaking world largely comes from the United States, going back to William Dorsey Swan in the late 1800s. Swan, who was born into slavery, just to put the timeline into context here, is the first person known to explicitly identify themselves as a queen of drag and express that in a way we would generally understand it today. When we talk about the beginning of the modern history of queer liberation, a lot of the discussion starts and ends at Stonewall. And while the contributions of those present, like Marsha P. Johnson, are obviously incredibly important, it is also just as important to acknowledge that this history extends back a lot further than we sometimes recognize. And crucially, that it was still black queer people leading the fight even back then. It's also important to recognize that, while drag is often reduced down to cisgender gay men performing as drag queens, that's not all it is. There are men, women, and non-binary people of all sexualities and gender identities who perform as drag kings, drag queens, or just generally drag artists. Drag generally relies on using gender as a vehicle for performance, similar to how VTubing generally uses animation as a vehicle for performance. But how you interpret and use gender for that performance is entirely up to the performer. Anyways, the major influence on drag as a modern art form is the ball scene in the 20th century, particularly the Harlem ball scene. Again, this isn't going to be a full history lesson, there is definitely more to this story and it's a very interesting history that people should look into, but if you're ever curious, a good starting point is the documentary Paris is Burning. That'll give you a bit of an intro. Drag was generally a bit of an underground art form for most of this period, with only rare exceptions. Mrs. Doubtfire was an in-universe drag performance by Robin Williams, while Edna Turnblad in Hairspray was originally played by drag queen Divine. The major change in terms of the mainstreaming of drag happened, as you can probably guess, with RuPaul's Drag Race in the late 2000s. RuPaul has been doing drag for a long time, including a music career, acting, and more, and launched RuPaul's Drag Race in 2009 on Logo TV as a bit of a parody of existing reality shows for drag queens. Over the years, it has become a cultural powerhouse in its own right, kicking its way into the mainstream. This has not been uncontroversial, particularly as the pushback against drag from conservative freaks has been severe in recent years. I'm sure some of them will find this video, and I'm happy to remind them right now that if they actually cared about protecting the children or whatever, they would be going after the developers of Kick, who've been running a child grooming app for over a decade without any real consequences. They'd go after the priests who abuse children and are protected by their churches, and they'd go after the conservative politicians who fight tooth and nail to protect child marriage laws in the US, Canada, and elsewhere. And they would go after the parents who abuse, abandon, or even murder their children after discovering that they're queer. Drag queens are not abusing children. They are not a risk to the safety of children, and if you cared about kids, you'd be addressing the people who actually are. Moving on. It is important to remember that a lot of the actions involved in drag are not exclusive to it. Similar to VTubing, while there are some actions that are unquestionably doing drag, there are a lot of things that depend on context and self-identifying the behavior with drag. Plenty of cishet boys and men dress up as girls and women on Halloween and vice versa, with no intention of doing drag in terms of the medium. And plenty of performers ranging from Lady Gaga to Dolly Parton identify with drag at least a little bit, despite not typically being seen as drag queens. There are also plenty of people who will express their gender in non-conforming ways, or trans people, and those are not the same thing as drag. It needs to be stated here. queer. However, with the mainstreaming of drag and its influences has come some protectionist sentiments. The modern day ballroom scene is in particular very protective of its practices, especially from mainstream shows like Drag Race, where there's a feeling that queens without a relationship to the scene are appropriating their culture by taking dance moves, language, and other concepts developed by them, misinterpreting them, and running with them. The broader drag community, specifically the Drag Race fandom, which is a Venn diagram with a lot of overlap but not total overlap with the broader drag community, tends to borrow a lot of language from queer history without necessarily knowing the roots. A lot of that language is also AAVE, or African American Vernacular English, which has become part of the scene through black drag performers and has been adopted, some would charitably say clumsily, by non-black performers. This is about Q.
Feminine than most people.
You're talking about, because this is my real hair.
Oh, okay.
This is I just snatched this up earlier.
Drag as an art form is very broadly characterized by dramatic makeup transformations, elaborate costumes, and performances, typically lip-syncing along to songs or spoken word. However, these are not mandatory elements, and plenty of drag performers engage with drag in entirely different ways because it is a shockingly broad medium beyond what the mainstream assumes. Similarly, while the mainstream understanding of drag typically just encompasses drag queens or RuPaul's Drag Race, drag is happening everywhere and is done by everybody. There are drag kings, there are other competitions like Dragula which focus more on horror, stuff like that. While drag is often performed in nightclubs, it is not exclusive to them. Drag performances can happen anywhere, and someone can be in drag without performing in a standard way, such as appearing at a protest in drag. For some queens, like Jinx Monsoon, drag is part of her acting career. For others, like Bob the Drag Queen, drag is part of her stand-up career. For still others, like the hosts of HBO's We're Here, drag is part of the equation because it's a solid gimmick or twist on a traditional television formula like a makeover show. Like with VTubing, drag is a medium that also serves as a vessel for other media to be performed through it, and of particular relevance for us, enhanced by the liberties you can take when you're operating under Jester's privilege. Anyways, this has been a bit of a longer history lesson than I had planned, but hopefully we're all on the same page for our next section. Part 2. Cringe, Camp, and Content. One of the biggest advantages of both styles of performance is that they both provide a facade to work through, which is shockingly liberating as a creative person. There's a lot of anxiety that comes with any sort of creative endeavor that involves being publicly visible, and that anxiety is a powerful inhibitor. Different creatives in these fields perceive their personas differently. Some people view their drag self or their VTuber self as just themselves with some bells and whistles, while others view it as a character that they're playing, an extension of their true self beyond what they can physically present, or an expression of a fantasy that they just enjoy fulfilling for themselves. One of the challenges of creativity, however, is that it's cringe. Sometimes it's camp, but oftentimes, especially when you're just starting out, it's cringe. Not only are you bad at the thing, but you're often not good enough at it to understand quite how bad you are, and you won't be for quite some time. There's a reason none of my old videos from like 2017, 2018, from when I first had a channel, are still up. We learn, we grow, and we improve. However, cringe can be a pretty massive hurdle to even just beginning the process of exploring your creativity. You have to be willing to overlook how bad you will be at something before you get good. You have to be able to recognize that it's a process of growth, and you have to be able to understand that there's no way to it but through it. Even if you recognize all of that, though, it can be helpful if you're just not going to be haunted by your efforts forever. Or if you can minimize how personal it gets. For me personally, part of why I like VTubing is that this little model is something I can put on when I want to be Viveros and take off when I don't want to be, the way I'd put on an apron to go work at Starbucks and then take it off at the end of my shift. I'm Viveros for this video, but when the video's done and uploaded and I shut off VTube Studio, I'm not going to the grocery store as Viveros. I get to go as me, and Viveros stays online. That's not how everybody feels about it, whether it's VTubing or drag, but this is just my own perspective to give you some context. The reason it matters, though, is that regardless of how you personally feel about it and interpret it, it often has the same effect of liberating you from the fear of cringe, at least a little. Like VTubing is, in my opinion, inherently cringe. I am an anime boy on the internet playing games and making my silly little video essays. However, since I am inherently cringe, I'm free. I might as well swing big. I can get fun artwork, I can lean into some silly branding, and I can engage with topics differently to how I would if my real face was speaking to you now as I did it. Prior to becoming a VTuber, there was always a threat of being cringe. But now, the cringe is inevitable, so the tension is kind of gone, and instead I can just enjoy myself. For a lot of drag artists, drag can be liberating in the same way. Whether they're playing a character or just expressing their truest selves, embracing the cringe frees you to go all the way and express yourself to the highest degree, and that's just genuinely a lot of fun. I've done drag before, and there's something about the fantasy coming together where, at a certain point, you're just kind of vibing as this whole other person. You might start to talk differently or walk differently, act differently, and enjoy yourself a lot because you're free. I know a lot of VTubers who would never sing on camera if their face was there for any number of reasons, but knowing that nobody can see their true face and that it's behind the character frees them up to just sing and have fun. It's like the dance like nobody's watching mentality. Nobody's watching you, the person, they're watching the persona. Now look, it's all an illusion. You and I both know that there is a real human being behind the VTuber, that the name on my driver's license is not Viveros, and that this is not an outfit that I am actually literally wearing. But just because it's an illusion, and just because you and I both know it's an illusion, doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect on us. My voice changes when I'm making a video, and I didn't even realize until I got my new mic while making the last video and my friends commented on it. Lots of drag queens are a lot more quiet and reserved out of drag, but put them in a wig and lashes and they're suddenly a whole new person. I'm going to be doing a karaoke stream soon as a donathon reward, which is something I would have never even considered if I wasn't a VTuber, because the idea of singing live as me, the person with a real name behind the model, makes me want to curl up and die. However, who cares if Viv Ross isn't a good singer? That guy's already cringe. Like, look at him. It's not like being a bad singer is going to change that. Part of the joy of this is that you can lean into it and make it campy, because the medium is inherently pretty campy. Like, you'll go into a VTuber's stream and they will tell you that they are a demonic catboy from hell with a straight face, and if that's not camp, I don't know what is. Being in drag or VTubing also just allows you more room in terms of how you present your content, because it changes how the audience can receive it. The YouTube show with Trixie Mattel and Katya Zamolodchikova probably wouldn't work as well if they were just two dudes named Brian sitting on stools in the basement of a production company. The fact that they're in drag enables them to not only be perceived as entertaining in a different way, but also enables the over-the-top editing and effects that the show is known for. If they weren't in drag, the editing would look like it's doing too much. But since they are in drag, the editing is just matching the energy of having a wig in the shape of a rotary phone and screaming at each other.
Oh my God. You have to remember that it's very hard to learn when you're constantly talking.
Keep that, Ron. Keep that one.
If you ever see my streams, I would never even consider having overlays or branding like this if I had a face cam. Like, if I was just some guy showing up in a t-shirt in my office with all of this stuff going on around me, it'd look like a bit much. But since I'm a VTuber, I can design a model that has a certain aesthetic and then get assets that match, which is what I did. However, at this point, we've talked a lot about drag and we've talked a lot about VTubers. And you might be wondering, when does the Jester's privilege come in? Part 3. Acting a fool. When we're talking about Jester's privilege, part of the requirement is that you play the role. Part of the reason why reality shows based around drag are often so successful is that drag is a medium that tends to require a big personality and enables it. If not all the time, then certainly while you're in drag. Both drag and VTubing tend to attract dramatic people who like attention and like causing a scene. And I want to make it clear, that's not a bad thing. It is a necessity. You don't just get Jester's privilege by virtue of putting on clown makeup and going about your day. You need to commit to the bit. At least in theory. VTubing is still so new to so many people that the act of VTubing in and of itself is clown behavior to a lot of them, so it kind of still gets there even if you don't do much with it. Like, I get a lot of comments saying you're a VTuber, opinion disregarded. If anything, it's working a little bit too well to put on the makeup. For drag though, this has become more complicated as drag has become more mainstream. And here's where I'd like to turn my attention to a spin-off of Drag Race called Untucked. Most US seasons of Drag Race have a side series called Untucked that airs alongside the show and is filmed during the short period between when the queens have been given their critiques and when they're called back to the main stage for the final lip sync of the episode. Untucked is where, in the words of RuPaul, half the story happens. However, for our purposes, it's also where the clown behavior tends to happen. And again, this isn't a negative. This is critical for drag artists to maintain Jester's privilege. Seeing drag queens being funny and messy and dramatic is part of what enables them to speak truth to power in a way that otherwise might not have been heard. In the very first season of the show, Angina won a challenge where she had to do a makeup commercial and followed it up on the main stage of the show by disclosing that she had HIV. In season 5, Monica Beverly Hills revealed that she was actually a transgender woman on the main stage right before performing a lip sync for her life to Rihanna's Only Girl in the World against Serena Chacha, which she won. Later that same season, Roxy Andrews revealed that she had been abandoned at a bus stop by her mother as a child before performing in a lip sync to Willow Smith's Whip My Hair, and doing the first wig reveal in the show's history.
I just feel like my mom never wanted me, and my mother left my sister and myself at a bus stop when I was 3. And I remember it like it was yesterday, and like I come off as this strong character. I try to stay so strong, but I'm so weak at the same time.
Part of why this works is the rapid tonal shifts. The show will go from having a fun time with contestants having to present their interpretation of a panel at a drag race convention to a serious discussion of someone's experience surviving sexual assault, and then to a lip sync of Diana Ross's I'm Coming Out, and it never really misses a beat from moment to moment. The serious discussions aren't lost in the shuffle. If anything, they're enhanced by the whiplash, and it makes the message stick in a way that it just couldn't if these were regular people speaking in plain clothes. RuPaul tearfully telling Roxy Andrews that as gay people we get to choose our families after learning about her being abandoned is not at odds with Roxy Andrews coming back a few years later for All Stars and Katya Zamolodchikova making a joke about how, I think about you all the time, especially in the morning, at the bus stop. Again, think back to that Bianca Del Rio quote that we started with. Well, obviously this is the packaging to get away with murder, because if I don't wear this, then they'll just say, oh, what a nasty gay person. But then you put this on and they say, oh, it's hysterical. And it's important to acknowledge that at a time when anti-queer sentiments are still very much so on the rise in a lot of countries that have drag race franchises, those franchises are still finding a lot of traction. The silliness, the shadiness, and the dramatics of it all hook people in because that's what the Jester does. They perform, they entertain, and they relax the audience so they can be heard more clearly. For many people, both those who are part of the queer community and those outside of it, Drag Race might have been the first place where they saw a trans person being presented as a person. Not that Drag Race has always been flawless about that, do not get me wrong, it has not, but it has gotten a lot better in recent years. Similarly, drag queens like Angina, Trinity K. Bonet, and Q all put a human face on HIV that does a lot to make it a tangible, real-world thing affecting real-world people who are, at the end of the day, still human beings. It's one thing to theoretically know that, but it is genuinely another to actually watch someone discuss being HIV positive. There's often a lot of tears, it's a difficult conversation, but it's a valuable one. Still, other queens like Latrice Royale have spoken at length about their incarceration for a non-violent drug offense in 2001 which left her disenfranchised, making her one of many black people disproportionately affected by felony disenfranchisement laws in the US that violated her democratic rights. She spoke about it multiple times on the show and was a consistent voice in favor of Amendment 4 in Florida that, in 2018, restored her right to vote. And yet, during the reading challenge for her first season, one of the jokes was about how she's free from prison, she doesn't need to keep wearing the yard sandals anymore. And she laughed at it. Everyone did, it was funny. And it's not like this doesn't have a bigger impact. Brooklyn Heights, the first Canadian queen on the franchise, got a meeting and photo op with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau prior to the finale of season 11, and he later made a guest appearance on the spin-off that she hosted, Canada's Drag Race Canada vs. the World. Sasha Colby, the winner of season 15, was celebrated on the floor of the US House of Representatives by a Hawaiian representative for being the first trans woman and Native Hawaiian winner of the US franchise. Nymphia Wynn, the winner of season 16, was the first Taiwanese winner of the show and went on to perform for the president of Taiwan along with her drag house in Taiwan, with the president even quoting RuPaul in a speech.
Shantae, you say, if you can't love yourself, how you gonna love somebody else?
These aren't small things. There was a point in time not very long ago where the idea of a world leader, or even just the leader of a major political party, participating in a pride parade was scandalous. Hell, depending on the country and party, it still very much so is. VTubing is still a newer art form, and perhaps more relevantly, is not as directly tied to any specific identity. As such, there's not really as much room for unified speaking truth to power moments, and it's one of the weaknesses of being part of a group of jesters primarily connected by just putting on the same clown makeup. Drag is predominantly a queer art form, meaning there's a lot more shared broad political, social, and cultural goals among drag performers. VTubers, by contrast, aren't really marginalized on a collective scale. That doesn't mean there's not still room for this, though. Plenty of VTubers have used VTubing as a way to discuss race and racism, to explore their gender or sexual identity, and to advocate for issues that they otherwise simply might not be able to, or to an audience they might simply not have access to otherwise. In a lot of ways, for both VTubing and drag, it's a million small things rather than one big thing. It's the way that both styles of presentation can enable a viewer to engage with someone they otherwise might not have, to see someone as human that they otherwise might not have connected with, and to build a more human connection with a more diverse range of people aided by that aspect of performativity and performance. That being said, one of the areas where I think VTubers have found some common ground is around disability. Whether it's neurodivergence or physical disability, VTubing can be a way to connect without the barriers that people often put up when dealing with someone who has a disability. And I would argue that the strongest case for that is Iron Mouse. Iron Mouse has common variable immunodeficiency, an immune system disorder that, to massively oversimplify, basically just makes her extremely vulnerable to infections. Iron Mouse can't really leave her house as a result, which became especially true during the pandemic. So she became a streamer, and since she didn't want to use her real face, she became a VTuber. Her platform has grown pretty fast, and she's regularly brought up her condition to raise awareness and funds. Her and her friend CDOG VA have raised a lot of money for the Immune Deficiency Foundation, and she's been an outspoken advocate for donating plasma as well. There's also stuff like Gamers Outreach, which is a charity you might have heard of that raises money for equipment and software to help kids in the hospital to have a bit of normalcy, and which also runs a special VTuber Summer Slam for VTubers specifically to raise some money. I'll actually be participating in that one in late June, so stay tuned for news about that. Actually, on my own front, last year we also raised a few $100 to support an Albertan organization that works to support queer people in rural Alberta amidst a pretty major pushback to queer rights in the province. I don't think I'm like an activist or something, don't get me wrong, I am not trying to overstate my case here. But I do think that there's some stuff that I've been able to raise awareness for over the last year that I don't think would have resonated as well if I weren't a VTuber. There are a lot of people who watch me on stream being a silly little guy and then come over to YouTube to hear a discussion about more serious topics about race, gender, sexuality, capitalism, or whatever else. I'd argue that Jester's privilege comes in two forms, speaking truth to power and speaking truth to the public. Depending on how democratic the place you're trying to influence is, they have different power. Jester's privilege under an authoritarian dictatorship or an absolute monarchy is different than under a liberal democracy because the importance of swaying individual powerful people directly versus swaying broader constituent groups that they rely on to maintain their power changes. However, both are still important regardless, and both play key roles. Forming through a character is just an extension of the way that we often learn through stories better than we learn through straightforward lessons. A story helps a message stick with you, and a drag artist or a VTuber is giving you a message through an attention-grabbing visage coupled with intentionally acting a fool to help the message go down smoother. Jester's privilege is traditionally conceptualized as the court jester getting to say an uncomfortable truth or even insult the powerful without facing punishment because they're entertaining, funny, and because punishing them would only make it clear that it's a weak point. And that's our next topic. Part 4. A delicate balancing act. One of the reasons why jesters could get away with the jokes that they'd make is because if the people in power do get defensive about it, it reveals that they struck a nerve. If one powerful person says something to another that gets under their skin, the decision to react is one based on exerting authority. If that person might pose a threat to your power, it is logical to respond in a way that tries to shut them down, to punish them for their dissent, or to expose their own secrets to make them toxic to their allies. If you're a dictator who pushes a high-ranking general out of a window for criticizing them, people might not agree with you morally, but they can at least understand why you did it, and it won't necessarily be perceived as a sign of weakness. However, if a comedian goes on TV and makes a joke about you being bald and you respond by arresting and executing them, you're telegraphing to the world that you are weak enough and vulnerable enough that a dig at you being bald is enough to send you off the edge. If a king kills the court jester for poking fun at him for not being able to produce a son, suddenly the court is very aware that the king might be a lot more concerned about this issue than they thought, and that's how you end up with the next in line developing notions. As well, implementing consequences is an acknowledgement of the power of the jester. You kinda have to ignore them and laugh them off, otherwise what they say does carry more weight just in general. Again, you might push a general out of a window to try and exert your power and authority, but if you push the jester out of the window, you're maybe equating them with people who are powerful enough to justify it in a way that you don't want. However, if the king can laugh along, and if the dictator can laugh along, they convey that they aren't worried about this stuff. Now, to be clear, a lot of kings and dictators would probably be more than happy to go back in time and silence the jester before he spoke. But until we develop time travel, that's not on the table. Once it's said, it can't be unsaid. Unless you're prepared to go full cult of terror, which is harder to maintain than you might think, you gotta be able to roll with the punches when the clown tells the joke. You don't even need to be a world leader for this to apply. You can just be a regular politician or even a high-ranking civil servant. The White House Correspondents' Dinner is a good example of comedians taking shots at politicians, which historically served to actually help the politicians a lot by humanizing them. Seth Meyers opened the 2011 dinner by making jokes about not only the birther movement, but Obama's decision to release his birth certificate just days before the dinner. And the camera cuts to Obama laughing about it to show he just isn't taking it that seriously. That vibe changed during the Trump era, with both the president and his administration not being in the mood for jokes very often. Part of this is that kind of hard-right politics doesn't really work as well if you're seen being cozy with mainstream media or being made fun of. If you're a strong man, you've got to appear strong, and comedy can be a powerful tool for taking the wind out of your sails and making you seem smaller, weaker, or just sillier. An example that got contentious during the time was when comedian Michelle Wolf commented that she loved then Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders as Aunt Lydia in The Handmaid's Tale, saying that she's Uncle Tom for white women who disappoint other white women, and argued that she is a pretty resourceful press secretary, saying that she burns facts and then uses that ash to create a perfect smoky eye. Like maybe she's born with it. Maybe it's lies. Sarah Huckabee Sanders visibly did not take that well, and it sparked a bunch of outrage towards Wolf from conservatives. But, in equal measure, it led to a lot of scrutiny towards Huckabee Sanders, who demonstrated that she was clearly uncomfortable with what was being said and that she couldn't laugh it off, even though she, like all press secretaries, had objectively told some lies. Keep in mind, by comparison, Obama was laughing at and even making jokes about his horrendous usage of drones in those same dinners just a few years earlier to try and diffuse it. Now, you might be wondering how this ties into the topic, and the answer is that it's important to remember why the powerful can tolerate the jester. It's not just because they're funny, it's that it can be a show of strength on behalf of the powerful to laugh along with the jokes, and that it can be possible for the powerful to take control of the narrative. Drag in particular is an art form that has historically existed on the margins, and while its mainstreaming has allowed drag artists more of a microphone, there's now a threat of that microphone being taken away. When Justin Trudeau made an appearance on Canada's Drag Race, Canada vs. the World, the Queens theoretically had the ear of a global leader. It could have been a moment to call out the Liberal Prime Minister for calling a snap election after the passage of a conversion therapy ban in the House, but before it passed in the Senate, which had the effect of killing the bill so that the Liberals could use it as a carrot-and-stick campaign promise against the Conservatives. It could have been a moment to criticize the weak federal response to the aggressive anti-LGBTQ+ laws in the provinces, or our weak response to the backsliding of queer rights in our allies. It could have been a moment to point out that the Liberal government routinely sidesteps addressing core issues facing queer people that reflect broader systemic issues, like how the housing crisis disproportionately affects marginalized people who make less money, have worse credit, and are more likely to face discrimination during the housing process. But instead, they didn't. Canadian politics were held up as a beacon of progress throughout the season, and it never amounted to any serious critique of problems that exist. Jester's privilege is a delicate balancing act, and knowing where and when to strike is a difficult thing to figure out, especially when you don't have time to prepare for it in advance. VTubers are less mainstream and so have less access to the mainstream and the powerful, but on a smaller scale you can see it in how many VTubers will tolerate racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, or whatever else in their chats, comment sections, and Discord servers out of fear that pushing back would lead to conflict. And some people will say, I don't want my entertainment to be political, I just want to be entertained. To which I personally think you're being kind of weak. I get not wanting all your content to be political, especially if you are a marginalized person who's already dealing with these issues and wants a bit of an escape, but nobody is suggesting making all entertainment political. Not every video I make is about capitalism or social issues or whatever. Sometimes it's just about a fuck-ass visual novel I hate. However, as a VTuber, I do get Jester's privilege, so I'm going to use it when I can to make a point that I think hits harder because I'm someone you might enjoy watching play Overwatch or suffering through Inescapable or whatever else. Again, part of Jester's privilege is knowing where and when to strike. You don't want to be trying to use it on a cooldown because then you're going to use it at the wrong times and on the wrong topics, but you also don't want to hold it forever because then you're just never using it. Social capital is a real thing, and spending it wisely isn't easy. And again, If you fuck up, there can be consequences. Maybe the most infamous version of this that people are going to be aware of if they're too online is Kelly Osbourne's appearance on The View, where she says, "If you kick every Latino out of this country, then who is going to be cleaning your toilet, Donald Trump?" Which one of the hosts immediately responds to with, "Oh, well, that's not." It was, in theory, a critique of the president that mocks him for relying on immigrant labor while demonizing immigrants. In practice, it sounds like Kelly Osbourne thinks all immigrants are just cleaning toilets and that's the value they bring to America, which, oh, that's not. VTubers and drag artists alike are capable of trying to send a message and failing spectacularly. Remember, earlier I mentioned that there are two kinds of Jester's privilege with the powerful and privilege with the public. Either one of those privileges can be revoked if you fuck up too much, and that can be either deserved or undeserved. Drag queen Sharon Needles, the winner of Drag Race Season 4, has lost her privilege with the public due to her racism, which I would argue is deserved. Someone like Janet Jackson, by contrast, lost hers with the public due to Justin Timberlake's bullshit and then inexplicably being blamed for what was done to her by him, while he walked away scot-free. During the Trump presidency, he pretty aggressively asserted his ability to grant or rescind Jester's privilege with the powerful, and with the public as much as he could. He'd very openly be positive towards media personalities who supported him, and if someone was critical of him, he'd try his best to remove their privilege with his base. To bring it back to that Canada versus the world thing, the queens on that season had no way of knowing what would happen to them personally if they said something. Would Trudeau lash out at them, particularly for the Canadians? Would there be backlash from the fans? If they antagonized him, would they risk turning a world leader against queer rights even just a little bit? Would they themselves be disqualified from the contest and unable to make more of an impact? Even if they did make a statement, would it just be edited out? What if that decision led to consequences for the show, limiting the show's broader ability to influence and network with powerful people who might be able to affect change, or the members of the public who support those people? Part of what prevents people from speaking up is the fear that it will lead to consequences, and for marginalized people, the threat of it can just be much more severe. That leads me into the reality that not all of us are being treated equally here. As a white guy, there are a lot of people who are receptive to what I say when I say it, but aren't receptive to it when a black guy says it. As a man, there are a lot of people who are receptive to what I say when I say it who wouldn't listen to a woman saying the same thing. But as a queer person, there are certain audiences I can't reach or who won't listen to me the same way they'll listen to a cishet person. The more privilege you have in general, the further your Jester's privilege extends. There's a reason why Drag Race fans often put so much pressure onto white queens to speak up about racism in the fan base, because everyone knows that someone who's racist to the black, indigenous, Hispanic, Asian, or other non-white queens is not going to give a shit if one of those non-white queens tells them that they're trash for being racist. However, Jester's privilege is still a privilege. There's a reason why the anti-trans, anti-queer pushback in the United States doesn't focus more heavily on RuPaul's Drag Race. After all, you'd imagine that a major national television show about drag would be a pretty easy target if you're pushing for drag bans, but instead the push is against shit like Drag Queen Story Hours. Why? Well, because it's kinda nebulous. RuPaul and the queens on her shows are famous, popular, and most importantly, named, known human beings. Anyone can go watch the show and see what it actually does, and going after them means you're picking on specific people. People have a lot more social capital than the theoretical local queen who's reading to 20 kids with their parents at a small town library. Drag Race does regularly use its social capital to push back against that rhetoric and advocate against bigoted culture war bullshit, and while they could still certainly use it better, it's at least something. RuPaul, as the queen of drag, at least in the present day, isn't going to be targeted by Donald Trump because he can't afford to even acknowledge her existence. She can produce an entire parody musical making fun of him and broadcast it to millions of people to mock, criticize, and belittle him, and that doesn't necessarily do good things for him, but if he responds, suddenly it shows that the queers have some power, that they're getting under his skin, and that's not going to have the same impact as fighting back against the already powerful mainstream media. The concept of Jester's privilege is one that a lot of performers hold, but drag artists and VTubers have a unique shared relationship to the concept because of the nature of both being heavily defined by being done through the mask of a character. The inherent unseriousness of the medium in the eyes of the average person opens up unique opportunities for influencing people and conveying important messages that otherwise might just not resonate. There are a lot of people who are watching this video right now because I'm a silly VTuber who made an angry rant about a bad visual novel, and while I think my content is good regardless, I think it'd be foolish to argue that being a VTuber doesn't play a role in developing the audience that I have, particularly those who found me from Twitch or Twitter and followed me here. The fact that I'm being represented as just a silly little guy counterintuitively helps me make more pressing arguments if, and this is a big if, I'm able to wield it effectively. If I was dressed up in a suit at my desk trying to look formal and proper and serious, it just wouldn't work as well for the audience I'm trying to reach. RuPaul sitting there looking like she just killed an entire family of ostriches for the outfit she's gonna wear for a single night while saying, if you can't love yourself, how in the hell are you gonna love somebody else, works a lot better than if she was just some tall bald dude saying the same thing. Jester's privilege is a privilege, and being aware of it is the first step towards using it to try and affect positive change in the world. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one because I have wanted to make it for a long time now, and I'm so glad it's finally out there. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. Channel members pay $5 a month to vote on new video topics, and this video was one of the ones they've chosen over the last year or so. There will be another Members' Choice video coming out next week about Buried Stars, a visual novel that I absolutely adored for how well it worked, and I promise you're not going to want to miss that one. Lastly, thank you to all my channel members. Minnie Q, Olesp, Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Dextiny, Yoshi of the Wire, Catlover192, Sourdough, Illuma Riley, Cadence, Windex the Great, V, Deleathers, Gavost, Marshallis, Crimson Cyclo, Good Guy Luis, Cactine Kushler, Aikri, Hallucigeno, MV, The Only Enigma, and Hazmat Bad at Games. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or you just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.